So going through the political nation, this refers to those people in early modern Britain who had economic, political and social influence. So the monarchy was the head of the political nation. Now, when we look at the social hierarchy within Stuart Britain, we can see that obviously the king is, or queen in Tudor period, but the king in this case was the head of society, as signified here in your book. Now, the political nation is obviously the bridging gap between the king and the rest of the population, or the commoners. So the political nation would have consisted of the nobility and the gentry. So just to kind of reiterate that the nobility are those born with social positions, so they are kind of hereditary peers, if you will. These are people with titles such as Lord, Earl, etc. So the Duke of Buckingham would have been part of the nobility, for example, because he's proclaimed to be a noble by the monarchy. The gentry are people who are not born into a position of entitlement by the monarchy. These are people who are the middle and upper classes who have wealth, but as a result of that wealth, they are not part of the nobility because they do not have a title. So you can be a landowner gentry, whereby you own quite a good proportion of land, which you rent out to working class people, for example, but you don't have a title such as Lord, Duke or Earl. In terms of power, though, the political nation refers to who holds that power. So whilst the rest of the population, the commoners, consist of the vast majority of those who live within Britain, they actually have very little political power or social or economic power at all. This is mostly concentrated with the king, and the king then shares that wealth and power with the political nation, so the nobility and to a lesser extent the gentry. So the political nation purely just looks at the structure of society and who holds that power. Now, in order to become part of the political nation, as shown in your pack, you had to have an annual income, so yearly income of 40 shillings or £2. This doesn't sound quite a lot, but actually in this period, it's quite a substantial amount of money with which to own. And this would then enable you to qualify to vote for an MP, so a member of parliament. However, members of parliament were simply selected rather than elected by members of the political nation. So the nobility more so, and the gentry to an extent, would select their local MP with which to represent them within the Commons. So note how the rest of the population, because they do not have any political power, do not get to determine who their MP is. And that signifies how important your wealth and status was within Stuart Britain in order to have any political say. Now, the hierarchy of Tudor and Stuart Britain was reflected in the Great Chain of Being, which is this source here. And this reinforced the acceptance of the social hierarchy for what it was. So at the top of our social hierarchy in the Great Chain of Being, we have God and spiritual connections to God as being the highest form of authority. And in order to kind of have any consistency within the world, you would have to ensure that you are devoted to God in terms of prayer, and you would have to ensure that you are following God's will. In order to avoid consequences such as harvest failures, famines, etc., you had to ensure that you had to keep God on your side. Now, underneath God is obviously the monarchy, and then we have the nobility, the gentry, working class people, wild and non-wild animals, followed by plants, etc. And right at the bottom we have the devil and hell. Now, this social hierarchy kind of reinforced the expectations of those in terms of your birthright. Obviously there are exceptions to the rule of people who escaped their class status and worked their way up, but that was very few and far between. So there was a growth size of the English population. Within the Stuart period, the population in London, for example, on its own doubled, and this resulted in factors that caused a bit of economic stress, such as inflation, food and land shortages, unemployment, and greater reliance on the state, so the government, for poor relief to support them. And as a result of these social strains, it was the lower strands of society, i.e. the working class, who faced the consequences of the increased population size. For example, many died from the lower classes from harvest failures in the 1620s. So land remained central to power and influence. So those who had control over agricultural land in particular could control food prices, and they they rented their land to the lower classes with which to work on. So they could state what the rental price would be on their land, they stated what the food costs would be, so on and so forth. So to be able to have any type of influence within Stuart Britain, you either have to be part of the nobility, descended from the crown itself, or be part of the gentry who owned land. So that is the end of the political nation. I will create further videos on other sections of this pack, but if you have any further queries, then please do ask in either email or in class.